Gen Z absolutely refuses to work the same way boomers did, but why? Why so against it? A recent survey found that 72% of Gen Z workers have quit or strongly considered quitting their job if the job wasn't flexible. Another found that Gen Z is asking for way more money than boomers did, with 55% of them negotiating job offers compared to 42% for boomers. The same study found on average that Gen Z expects a 10% annual raise, even without a promotion, which was 42% higher than what boomers expected when they were asked the same question. Does Gen Z expect too much at work, or are they the first generation to really hold corporations accountable for what's theirs? Well, I looked at a lot of data and I think I have the answer. The baby boomer generation, born approximately between 1946 and 1964, entered the workforce during a time of fairly unprecedented economic growth. Between 1950 and 1973, U.S. productivity nearly doubled and real wages grew steadily alongside with it. A high school diploma was often enough to secure a stable, upwardly mobile employment. In return for strong loyalty and long hours, employers offered job security, beautiful pensions, healthcare benefits, and a clearly defined path to retirement. This was the foundational structure of the mid-20th century labor contract. Boomers were taught both culturally and economically that hard work over time would be rewarded. Pay your dues is literally how it would play out. Long tenures, minimal job hopping, and deference to hierarchy was part and parcel with that era. In 1983, the median tenure for a private sector worker was nearly a decade. Today, that number is closer to 4 years, and for Gen Z in their early careers, it's often between 1 to 2 years. A key reason for this long-term commitment was the promise of retirement security. Defined benefit pension plans, which was the norm for private sector employees in the 1980s, was rewarded by those who stayed the course. The longer you remained, the more generous the payout was. This pension structure was explicitly designed to discourage mobility and incentivize loyalty. Promotions were performance-based, but also tenure-driven. In large firms, career ladders were formalized in HR departments, and mentorship often meant climbing behind someone on a predefined path. The implied promise was clear. If you showed up, if you stayed late, if you didn't complain, and you paid your dues, you'd eventually reach financial stability, you'd own a home, you'd retire with dignity. It's not a bad promise. The contract worked for many. Boomers became one of the wealthiest generations in history, controlling over half of U.S. wealth by 2023, despite representing roughly a fifth of the population. They bought homes young, they benefited from rising asset values, and were somewhat shielded from many modern labor market shocks. Over time, that structure has changed, and Gen Z has taken a different approach to work. As a result, housing, wages, and debt have each moved in ways that materially alter how Gen Z chooses to navigate their career. In 1980, the median home price in the US was approximately between $50,000 and $60,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $290K. Yet the actual median home price in 2025 exceeds $420K, according to Federal Reserve data. This gap represents a substantial increase in the cost of home ownership relative to previous generations, especially for younger workers whose early career earnings, which we are about to touch on, have not kept pace. Wage growth has diverged from productivity. Between 1979 and 2021, net productivity in the US increased by nearly 70%, while hourly compensation rose by only 20%, according to the Economic Policy Institute. We also have to talk about student debt. The average Gen Z borrower carries approximately $20,000 in student loan debt, but many have a much larger debt load, sometimes well into the six figures. Since 1980, the cost of attending a 4-year public college in the US has increased by over 180% after adjusting for inflation, far outpacing wage growth, housing, or consumer prices. And as we've touched on in several of the last videos, the US economy today is just not the greatest. Deloitte projects US GDP growth at 1.4% this year and 1.5% in 2026. That's not recessionary, but that's also not that strong. Inflation has chilled, but it's still a tad sticky, holding around 2.8 to 3%. And the job market macro-wise is starting to slip, with some economists putting the odds of a downturn within the next 12 months at roughly 1 in 3. Another thing that is very, very important to note here is that over the past few decades, two of the most powerful employee retention tools, pensions and employer-provided healthcare, have fundamentally changed. In 1980, over 60% of private sector workers had access to a defined benefit pension. Today, that number is less than 15%. The majority have shifted to a defined contribution plan like the 401k, which transfers both the risk and the responsibility more so to the worker. Healthcare coverage has also followed a somewhat similar path. Rising costs, more narrow networks, and increased employee cost sharing have eroded its value as a very big loyalty incentive. In many cases, many of the benefits once tied to long-term tenure have become somewhat unstable and somewhat conditional, which further weakens the rationale for somebody to stay at one company for their entire career. Now, you might be wondering, does it not always feel super unfair for the youngest generation? Of course, perceptions of unfairness are not unique to Gen Z. Historically, younger generations have often viewed the socioeconomic landscape that they inherit as imbalanced. An obvious example is millennials with 2008. What distinguishes Gen Z is the volume and the clarity of comparative data available in real time. Through social media, salary transparency, and platforms that track corporate metrics, younger workers can now see instantly and globally how their outcomes are comparing to their peers, to their managers, and to past generations. This constant stream of data makes disparities even more visible than ever before. At the same time, institutional trust has declined across all age groups, but especially among younger cohorts. When trust erodes, systems feel less fair, even if processes remain somewhat the same. Gen Z has entered the workforce during a period of inflation, of wage pressure, and technological disruption, all while being compared to older generations who may have benefited from earlier periods of economic expansion. As a result, they operate with a heightened sense of awareness of when systems no longer serve them, and they are more willing to adapt accordingly. So how does Gen Z actually approach and think about work? Well, firstly, Gen Z just values work differently in general. According to Deloitte's 2024 Global Gen Z survey, younger workers consistently prioritize flexibility, well-being, and alignment with personal values over traditional markers like time and role or title advancement. Career paths have become more fluid and less like linear ladders as a result. According to Randstad, Gen Z changes jobs nearly 3 times faster than Gen X or Boomers during their early careers. Where earlier generations were encouraged to pursue advancement through internal loyalty and tenure, younger workers are more likely to seek external opportunities that provide more immediate increases in compensation and scope. The labor market has evolved to reward lateral mobility, and Gen Z's behavior reflects that reality. It's not a sure thing to wait your turn and earn more. That's just not how it works anymore. And Gen Z's approach to employment and their ambition to gain leverage early shows that they understand that. Again, as we touched on in the beginning of this video, 55% of Gen Z reported that they negotiate their job offers compared to 42% of baby boomers. Among those who engaged in negotiations, 79% reportedly received a better offer. Some view that as audacious, but honestly, Gen Z is just more likely to advocate for themselves earlier in their career than previous generations. Let's also not forget that young professionals' orientation towards how they view work was probably shaped by long-term observations of how companies treated their parents. They may have saw their parents or caregivers be at a company for decades, only to just get laid off or have their benefits reduced or have their career stall out because of a financial downturn. It's just business, as they say. In some cases, loyalty to just one employer did not actually result in a predictably upward career. It was just a risk to stay and depend on something for too long. The career moves that Gen Z makes seem to recognize that there are a lot of external factors, whether it's restructuring, automation, or macro shifts that just override personal performance or effort. Even if you work hard, sometimes it doesn't matter. As a result, Gen Z is more likely to interpret stability as the ability to remain mobile, adaptable, and independent of any one institutional structure. The motto is staying ahead of the game, and you could make a really good argument that that's kind of necessary in today's environment. Put simply, they gotta do what they gotta do. And if that means going from job to job, if that means aggressively negotiating, if that means ruffling some feathers earlier in their career, it is purely based on their assessment of the economy and them protecting their interests. They refuse to work like boomers because if they work like boomers, they may not get what boomers got. It's as easy as that. It's a different world with different incentives and different outcomes, so Gen Z's working differently. If Gen Z believed that there was a golden pot waiting for them at the end of the rainbow and the path to get this golden pot was proven, I mean, they would just do that. They would stay at a company if they knew that they were going to get that golden pot. But if they were told it might be there, it might not be there, I don't know, why would they trek all the way over there? Now, the one thing I do want to say is that while Gen Z is facing a tough economy, there's still plenty of opportunity out there, and plenty of young workers are showing example after example that you can be extremely successful much faster in your career and redefine what your career means a lot differently than other generations. If you're Gen Z, just understand that taking an alternative approach towards your career does not mean you're not going to be successful. How people work and how people are compensated is changing at an insane pace. There's plenty of ways to arrive at where you're trying to get to. You're just going to have to adapt to this very different landscape. But you do also have a ton of different tools at your disposal to help you get there that did not exist just a few years ago. And if you're in the older generation, please try to understand why Gen Z moves the way they do. It's simply an adaptation mechanism. It's not simply a matter of entitlement or laziness or any sort of basic explanation you could throw at it. It's an approach that they're using to just live a good life. So try and meet them where they are.